This week, we're going to take a look at the Industrial Revolution, which is a movement that happens primarily in Europe to start with, in the 18th century, early 18th century, mid 18th century, all the way up until the start of the 20th century. And so we're going to see this movement take place. It's going to bring about a lot of new technology like the steam engine and locomotives, and it's going to bring about factories and all the kind of mass production that we're used to seeing today. And with that, though, there's going to be some downside of, as you can see, pollution in that picture, and also we're going to have a downside with labor practices that are going on, especially things like child labor, where we have young kids working in these factories. But before we get looking at those things, we have to know why did it happen? What allowed this industrial revolution to happen, and why did it happen in Europe and not anywhere else? Other areas of the world where it was a possibility there could have happened in China, could have happened in India, the Middle East, somewhere like that. You might have thought that, hey, they've been a big powerhouse. It should have happened there, but it didn't. And that's because Europe had a couple of unique instances, just like we saw with them going out and exploring and finding North America and doing all that age of exploration stuff. Big thing here in Europe is we have this rivalry that's always kind of been around ever since the fall of Rome. Britain hates France, France hates Germany, the Germans hate the Italians hate the Spaniards, and they all hate each other in some way, and they all want to one-up each other. As we saw at the start of the colonization of the Americas and the exploration, they all want to one-up each other, so that's still happening here, and that they want to get the next technological advancement to put themselves above the other country. Second thing is the governments support businesses a lot better than in the rest of the world. They are pro-business. They like the merchants. If we remember back in China, Confucianism kind of gets us to not like merchants too much. In the Middle East, the Islamic states like merchants, but they don't have a huge industry going on. They're more selling and trading and selling it to Europe. So the governments in Europe are supporting this because they want to bring in more money. They don't have tax breaks, though. It should be tax breaks, so my fault on the spelling error there. They allow monopolies. Like when we looked at the East India companies, those have monopolies over all the trade in the Indian Ocean for that country. So they allow these monopolies. They give loans out, low interest loans to groups. They have those joint stock companies that are there to help people start up a business. And so they're very business friendly, which makes it very nice for factories to get some capital and then start that up and then start making money. They are also at the center of global trade because they control the Americas. They control a lot of the resources coming out there. They are the center of world trade. They're sending things to China. They're getting things back from China. They're getting a lot of money coming in, and they got a lot of things going out, and they see kind of all the technology and innovations and ideas that are coming about, and they put all those together and build off of that. They are also in a very unique situation where they have all the natural resources you need. Things like iron and coal are going to be the two main components of this. Iron, because you need a strong metal that will eventually become steel with the right process, and coal, which will become the main source of fuel. They have all this, especially in Britain where this starts. They are lucky in that they have iron and coal to be able to start this process, and then they keep building off of that. And the last thing is there's been population growth. So with this population growth, there's surplus labor, and this population growth, if you remember, came from the Columbian Exchange with all the new crops that came to Europe, the potatoes, the corn, all that improved the diets, and so the population grew. Along with that, though, people started losing their farms because of these acts called the Enclosure Acts in Britain, which gave the land, or the land was taken over by the rich, wealthy aristocrats. So they got larger tracts of land. Other people couldn't support their small farms, so they sell their farm and move towards cities. And in these cities, you have this excess labor, and you got to figure out something to do with them. And they are cheap workers, and factories start popping up and start using that labor. So what happens is once the Industrial Revolution kicks off, we have now kind of the three distinct classes that you might think of that we have today. You'll have an upper class, you'll have a middle class, you'll have a lower class. And in this, in that upper class, you're going to have the kind of aristocrats, the really, really wealthy businessmen, and also the aristocrats, the people that used to have a lot of power, and the landowners. Their power is going to wane or go down at this time just because owning land isn't the most important thing or doesn't make you the wealthiest anymore. Instead, having a very, very successful business is going to help you reach new heights. So with these aristocrats, if they're British, usually they're going to go over to one of the colonies, so South Africa, India, Australia, somewhere to help run that colony. Um, but the wealthy businessmen will also kind of stay at home and run the government there. They kind of take over the political parties in Britain or wherever they are at. And then the second class there that we'll look at here is the middle class, which are kind of the professionals or the business owners that aren't the super rich, like an Andrew Carnegie here who owned American Steel, or a Henry Ford or a Rockefeller, just thinking of kind of a U.S. Figures. Um, they're the business owners, they're the professionals, they're the non-manual laborers. So anyone in the service industry, secretaries, teachers, professors, anyone you want to think of like that, lawyers, bankers, all those people are part of this middle class. And they are educated. And they have a unique view, which is why I have this quote in from Andrew Carnegie, which is, there is no use whatever trying to help people who do not help themselves. They believe that they got to this position they're in, whether they're upper class or middle class, because they worked hard to get it, they got educated, and because of that they earned it. And the lower classes who are doing all this hard manual work, it's their own fault. It's not because life is unfair or anything like that, but it's because they're not working hard enough to get themselves out of that position. They were able to get themselves out of it, so these people should be able to do it, and they're just not doing it because they're not spending their money right, time right, whatever the issue may be. So let's take a look at those lower classes. Lower classes are the manual workers. They're the ones doing the brunt of the labor, and they get long hours in the workshop, factory, mine, wherever it is, and they get really, really low wages, and they are very, very dangerous jobs. Okay, think about coal mining. There is no protection of masks at this time like we have today, and even with masks today, there's still possibly a black lung and things like that where your lungs fill up with coal. Here, they don't even have any masks, or they just wear a rag. And these are kids starting off in the mines. They don't live very long. These child laborers that pop up, it's unfortunate they won't live a very long life because they are going to be beat up by the system. Their lungs are going to fill up with coal, and so they're not going to be able to live very long because they'll die of black lung. Others in the factories are getting arms, hands, limbs taken off because they get their hand or something caught in the machine and it rips it away. So it's very dangerous. And not only is it dangerous in the factories for them, but it's also dangerous at home. The cities are overcrowded. The areas that they're living are kind of apartments with several families on a floor. You have a small living area in your apartment. These are called tenements, and it's just crowded. You're in there with your whole family. It's not sanitary. There isn't indoor plumbing or anything like that at the start of this. Instead, you have something called a chamber pot that you do your business in and then toss it out onto the street. And then on the street, there's no one there to kind of clean it up right away. So it's very unsanitary in these areas where there are lots of people. And so, as you might guess, this leads to a lot of disease and everything else spreading, which doesn't help them out. So not only they're working in bad conditions, they're living in kind of bad conditions. So things aren't very good, and we're going to see that's going to lead to some protests and some changes that will eventually happen. The other thing that's going on is women. Again, as we've kind of seen, the main theme in history here is that they kind of get pushed to the side and don't have a lot of rights, and it's no different here. The idea that a woman is supposed to stay at home and not work and make dinner and raise the kids and all that fun stuff, or terrible thing, if you want to say that's a terrible stereotype, is it kind of starts here. Ladies were allowed to work or were expected to work up until they got married. Then once they got married, they went home. Went to the home and worked at home. Raise the kids. The goal, if you were middle class or upper class, was that your wife would not have to do any work at all. And then if you were lower class, they'd work up until they got married, and then they'd do some laundry or some type of day-to-day work that could bring in a little bit extra cash. But they did not have many rights. And when we see conditions change for laborers, it's mainly going to be men and not women. They're just not going to be treated the same, and same with children. They're not going to be treated the same as men. Eventually, we'll see, though, an end to child labor, luckily, and that's why you guys are all able to sit here in class or in school for 6-8 hours a day instead of working in a coal mine or some factory, like was the case at this time. So, as we saw with these bad conditions, people don't like them. They realize it's not good, and so they start fighting. First thing they do is they start to create unions. Now, these are illegal to start with, but they kind of don't call them unions then, and then they become legal, and then they become unions, and they organize formally. And what a union is, it's an organization to fight for um, people's rights, workers' rights at that job or within that job set that a group of people works in. So an example of union is for myself is teachers are part of a union. There is a teachers union that unites all the teachers and kind of argues for stuff or argues positions and things we'd like to the school board and to the state and to the federal government. There are teacher unions, there are welders unions, there are pipe fitters, all those different groups, skilled jobs have some type of union usually. Um, and they'll fight for wages and better conditions, and they do this. And although the businesses don't like this, when they protest, they go on strike, they destroy machines and do all that stuff, it gets them to realize, okay, we got to do some things. And also the government kind of steps up and says, yeah, we got to fix some of our regulations and things that we're doing poorly here. Um, so when they do this, it works sometimes. Later on, it works a lot more once unions are allowed. But before that, there is a brutal suppression where the military would come in or police would come in and pummel the people that were protesting, and it would kind of become like a little bit of a riot and stuff like that. So not really good times there. But as time goes on, things get better. And that's kind of a common theme we're going to see here as we go through. Those unsanitary conditions, because of protests, because of government involvement, it's going to get better. The government realizes, hey, we got to do something, otherwise people are going to revolt, and that's not a good thing. So they start fixing it up. That's why we have indoor plumbing nowadays. That's why we have street sweepers and all those things to come and clean up the streets and make sure that there isn't a bunch of filth on them. Okay. Now, what this all developed out of, why it stayed, why it was this way that there wasn't much regulations on it, is because of an economic system that was developed by Adam Smith called capitalism. Um, and then we're going to see another system come up called communism or socialism, um, where that's developed by Karl Marx. That's there to kind of fight back against capitalism. Um, with capitalism, the main thing that it preaches is a thing called laissez-faire, which means literally let it be. And it means that the government shouldn't really regulate businesses too much because businesses are going to do the right thing in a perfect world. They will treat people well because it's good to treat people well. They'll give people fair wages because it's the right thing to do. Um, but this is kind of in a perfect world that this happens, and in real life, as you might be able to see with things in modern day, that doesn't necessarily happen, unfortunately. So the government has had to step in some countries, there's a lot more leaning to this socialism idea or this communism idea where the government takes care of the people, and others that kind of push away from it, but there's always some type of mix of it. We don't have any truly capitalist countries. The closest one that we have that's truly capitalist would be the United States, but even there we have some social programs that reform things. And these reforms are things like regulating business with work days, minimum wages, whether child labor is legal or not, what kind of working conditions women will work in, that men will work in, what can be produced, how much, all that stuff, and they try to fix sanitary positions to make life better for people. And an example of one of these reform movements would be the Labour Party in Britain. It was brought about um, to bring these reforms, to fix things, and kept kind of a communist socialist revolution from happening that we'll see with Marx. In the U.S., though, we don't really have that, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds here when we get to examples in the U.S. and Russia. Now with socialism and communism here from Karl Marx. Um, Karl Marx was a kind of philosopher, social scientist that said, you know what, this industrial revolution is not working. People are living in terrible conditions. They're frustrated. They hate their life. They hate the factory owners. The factory owners have way too much money and they're not distributing it to the poor. And so, therefore, what's going to eventually happen is people are going to rise up against these factory owners, what he would call the bourgeoisie, And these poor people, or the proletariat, will rise up in a violent revolution, overthrow the bourgeoisie, that rich class, the rich upper class, and possibly in the process kill them off, take over the government, redistribute the property equally between everyone, redistribute wealth between everyone, and then the government would then control the businesses. But eventually, actually, in an ideal communist state, the government would disappear and you wouldn't need it anymore. Become kind of a state of anarchy, if you know what anarchy is. But not a bad anarchy. It's everyone's living in peace and, again, nice, perfect world type thing. Now, as we saw with capitalism, with communism and socialism, that doesn't necessarily happen. These are ideal systems. In real practice, socialism has worked. It's worked in well with capitalism being mixed there. If you think of the Scandinavian countries, if you know those, they have a good mix of high taxes with lots of government programs to help support their citizens. So that's worked out. But there are systems like when we see communism take over in Russia and in China, it doesn't work out too well. This idea that the government's going to go away or lessen its power and spread wealth out equally just doesn't happen because we're human beings and we don't really work that way. We don't work in a perfect society, or we don't do everything for each other. We get kind of greedy and we focus on ourselves, and we get power hungry when we get put into those positions. And so you have people like Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin who make a very, very strong government that beats up its people and kills millions upon millions of them. I mean, Stalin will kill over 10 million or something like that. He'll kill a lot. And we look at him as a kind of a nice guy because he didn't kill as many as Hitler. Or, well, actually, he killed more than Hitler, but he was our ally, so we don't look at him as bad. But we'll talk about him when we get to the modern world after the 1900s. So now, for an example of a capitalist state or capitalist country, the United States is a good one here. If you think about us today, you look at politics, everyone's fighting against, oh, don't let socialism happen. Socialism is a terrible thing. We never want to have actual socialism come here. It's terrible. It's un-American. That starts during this time period. Businesses push to not have any socialism type ideals here. It becomes part of our mantra that we don't really need it. And so we have loose government regulations that allow businesses to do kind of what they want to do or feel is necessary. Also at this time, we are growing rapidly because of the wealth in farmlands, as you can see here in Iowa, that we have that helps population grow. But also, we are bringing in lots of immigrants. That excess population that we talked about at the beginning, leading to this industrial revolution, doesn't stop. It keeps growing. The industrial revolution has actually kept the population growing very, very rapidly. And we are still growing very rapidly. And we'll take a look at kind of what's happened to world population throughout history at the very end here. But they need to go somewhere. They don't have enough room in Europe for them at this time. There's not enough housing and jobs and everything. So they come here to America. And if you think of America, we're known as the melting pot of the world. We absorb all these cultures. Now, there are some we absorb more readily than others. We liked Western Europeans and Northern Europeans from Scandinavia and France and Britain and those areas. We didn't really like the Irish and Italians and Eastern Europeans right away, but we eventually learned to accept them. We also brought in a lot of Chinese and Asian immigrants, but at the same time we start pushing those out during this time period too, because well, people get fearful about these new groups coming in and we don't know them and they're not true Americans. So we are accepting of immigrants. At the same time, we kind of push some of them away and keep it from happening. The big thing, though, that happens in the U.S. that's a little different and keeps this revolution going is an idea of mass production. Now, this started in Europe with Britain, with Germany, with France. All those areas start this, and they use something called interchangeable parts, where you have small pieces of machines or small pieces of that make up the product that you're making that you easily assemble and put together. Now, the one difference is most of the time people would work on, if we're talking about a car, you'd have 5 people working on that car from start to finish. However, Henry Ford, the maker of Ford, the car company, decides, wait, this doesn't sound like the best idea. 5 guys working on a car the whole time. What if I just make this mind-numbing and make some type of an assembly line type deal where someone does the same job over and over and over and over and over again? I don't have to train them that much. They can sit there and do that all day. They can be like a monkey almost and just put it in there and it'd be all good. And so he develops the assembly line, which is now kind of what almost everything you have, this computer that you're looking at this through, your pencil, everything that you're looking at, you have, is probably made on an assembly line somewhere in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's here in the United States or over in China or over in India or wherever else it was manufactured. So the assembly line comes out of this. That's a major development. And with this, products get even cheaper than they were. Um, and people are starting to make more money because we have higher wages. They're still low, but they're a little bit better than Europe is. And so we have this idea of consumption, and you think about Black Friday and Christmas and all that season we just got out of a few months ago. Um, it's all about buying, 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 buying. And you can still see if you look at commercials, it's all about buying, 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 buying. Well, this didn't just happen overnight. It hasn't been a recent event. It's been something that's been developed since the mid to late 1800s, definitely the 1900s, where it was, you need to buy this, buy this, buy this, buy this. And so that starts at this time period, and we get this culture of consumption. So we have a culture of letting immigrants in, of avoiding socialism, and of consumption. This makes the U.S. thrive off of capitalism and in this new industrial revolution. On the other hand, Russia is not as lucky. Russia is an absolute monarchy, where if we looked at the United States was a democracy or representative democracy, where most people could vote, not everyone could vote, but we let a good amount of people vote, maybe more than other countries were at this time, or definitely more than most countries were at this time. So Russia is almost the exact opposite. They have an absolute monarchy, no democratic forms of government. That eventually comes later. After 1905, they finally get something called the Duma, which brings in some democracy, but it really doesn't do much. The Tsar still does what he wants, and so we got the Tsar here over on the top left, Tsar Nicholas II. He will also be the last Tsar, and we'll talk about him more with World War I. But his daughter is the famous Anastasia, who went missing, and they thought survived the assassination of him or the killing of his family, but she unfortunately didn't, and she was just in a different grave. Story for another time, though. So, with Russia, with the Tsar, the reform process is very, very slow because he's not used to change a lot, doesn't want to change things too drastically, he wants to maintain his control, wants to keep it under everything under his lock and key. And this also means they're slow to address issues because, well, he doesn't want to fix the issues too quickly. He doesn't want to upset his wealthy people that are running the businesses, and the poor people, well, they're the poor people, and he doesn't really worry about them. Also, with this industrialization, is not all over the place, like we might see in Europe. I mean, everything is always focused around the cities, but it happens all over Europe in the major cities. In the U.S., it happens all across the eastern seaboard, and then we can see it in other areas like Chicago or Cleveland. All the major cities that you might think of in the East Coast and the Midwest kind of all get their start here with that. In Russia, it's mainly in just the really, really big cities of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev in Ukraine, that this happens. It doesn't happen throughout all of Siberia. They kind of leave Siberia alone, as it's Siberian, it's cold, and no one wants to go there. The one thing they do is build a railroad across it, but there isn't a whole heck of a lot they do in that region. It's mainly focused in western Russia, around Moscow, St. Petersburg, those major cities. But people in those cities, it's not a huge chunk of the population, but they carry a lot of weight because they're right around the capital where the Tsar is, and when they go through these bad living conditions, bad working conditions, and things don't get fixed, or they say they're going to get fixed, but then they don't get fixed, things start going poorly. And they start revolting, and they get really upset. They calm down after they get the Duma in 1905, but that didn't fix the problem, so they get upset again, and then World War I happens, and Tsar Nicholas II kind of gets kicked out and eventually killed. And to replace this absolute monarchy under the Tsar, what happens is a guy named Vladimir Lenin leads this Red Revolution, or the Communist Revolution in Russia. And Russia now becomes a Soviet state and becomes known as the USSR. Or the United Soviet States of Russia. So he sets this up, and so this is when Russia becomes a communist state. Again, we're going to take a look at this a little bit later, but it's good to know this because this shows how Russia kind of industrialized, but also didn't do a good job. This is where we actually had the only real violent revolution against what was going on in capitalism. at this time. So they go against it. The communist government still goes and starts keeps the industrialization going. They really try to bump it up, and that's why Russia is able to be successful in World War II. They get the snot beat out of them at the beginning, but as we talked about with Napoleon and other leaders, you usually don't want to invade Russia, especially when winter comes around, and Hitler needed to take another history class or something like that because he didn't learn that before. So that's Russia. They succeed, but they're not a total success in that they have capitalism. They switch over because capitalism is failing for them, and they go to communism. The last group we're going to look at is Latin America, and this is a region that kind of just doesn't industrialize very well. Um, as you know, the Latin American revolutions break Latin America up into many different countries, actually 18 countries, and they're divided based on culture and everything else. They're not connected too well. And within these countries, they don't have really strong governments. Everyone's vying to be the next leader, and so you have these guys named caudillos, or the military men, who kind of eventually end up running the countries. Most famous one that you might know from history would be a guy named Santa Anna. If you know the Mexican-American War, he's that general during that time um, in Mexico, and he becomes president several times in Mexico because of his military power to try to bring Mexico back from destruction or just chaos and everything else. So they start leading these countries. That doesn't produce stability. One thing I didn't bring up in the previous areas of when we're talking about Europe, when we're talking about U.S. and Russia, even though Russia goes through that revolution, they are fairly stable. The government doesn't change often. People know what's going on. They're living okay lives. In Latin America, um, it's not stable. There's constant threats of revolution happening, and so the leaders are trying to um, get things in order, but it just doesn't easily happen. Once things start finally to settle down, Europe brings in new technology, things like the telegraph, things like the steam engine, to help the process of industrialization and help communication better. And they also bring in loans to fund this. But um, it doesn't work out too well because there isn't an incentive for the Latin Americans to do this. Um, for the lower class, there is because they're hoping they can get out of poverty, but they don't control anything. The Creoles control everything. They control the land. They control everything else, and so they don't have a huge incentive because the Europeans are buying all their natural resources. So if I'm a Creole, I'm thinking, well, why do I need to spend the money in making a factory when I've got European people that will pay me thousands of dollars or millions of dollars for this product that I keep selling out every year? So I'm just going to keep it that way. So they do that. The laborers work on these farms and plantations and everywhere else for very cheaply, or in the mines. They don't get much out of it. So on top of not having a lot of factories, they don't produce a lot, and they also don't produce a culture of consumption like we see in the United States because the lower class doesn't have the money for it. And so what happens is the Europeans and the United States keep sending these finished products to the Latin Americans, and they keep buying them up, but they aren't able to kind of break off on their own and do their own manufacturing, and they don't have a lot of the money to sponsor that. And so what happens is some people will call this a new colonialism, which is why I have a question mark there, because some people are arguing that it's new colonialism and that the Europeans and the United States control these areas now, and will go in and fight for their businesses' rights that go in there. But at the same time, it's not real formal. They don't technically control the government or anything like that, but it is kind of a form of new colonialism where the West will control Latin America. Okay? Now, this is the last thing we have on this, and that's the effects of the industrialization. Big thing to know here is this begins something called the Anthropocene age, or the age of man, which means man essentially controls the world and what's going to happen in it. This could be for the better or this could be for the worse. Um, we're able to now control the world because of all the new inventions we have, that new technology, the steam engine. We can go around the world now in a steamboat much faster. That eventually leads to the car, which eventually leads to other innovations. We eventually get airplanes and everything else. And now we pretty much can control the environment and what we're doing here. We can destroy mountains. We can level forests. Do whatever we want to do to the planet. We could destroy it or we can try to build it back up. Um, So that's what makes this the Anthropocene age, or the age of man, where we can control everything. Um, with this, what happens is, or with the other effects of the industrialization are, one, we have a drastic population increase. If you look at the chart here, you can see we never really got close to 1 billion people until into the modern age. The modern age is going to be looking at, when we're talking about around 1500 or so, we're getting close to that. And you can see within the last, what, 500 years or so, we've gone from 1 billion people to, or even less than 500 years, 1 billion people to, we're at near 7 billion by 2025. They're thinking over 8 billion people. This is a huge population growth, and this is causing um, some strains in regions of the world that aren't fully industrialized, or that are having a hard time in industrializing. This is also leading to environmental devastation. If you've seen Al Gore and all the global warming stuff, or not even Al Gore, but just all the global warming stuff, that comes from this, because the fuels we burn for this are oil, natural gas, coal. We're still burning a lot of those, and it all starts kind of here. We also, at the same time that we're burning all these things, putting a lot of CO2 in the air, we have deforestation going on, so we're taking out the forests that then filter that. So we're causing maybe a few problems there with that. That is just causing a lot of environmental damage, pollution in the ocean, all that fun stuff, or terrible things, is also not very good. Now, things do get better. We start building back the environment some towards the end of this, and nowadays we're trying to do that more, protect things, but at the same time, um, it's not enough to fix some of the problems that we have going on already. Another effect is cheaper goods and more jobs. We have a lot more jobs nowadays than we did before, which we have to because we got more people. And we also have a lot more goods, inventions, technology, and all these things are getting cheaper. Um, the first computers were the size of the classroom we're in, or bigger than the classroom we're in. Now you've got a computer that's on your desk, weighs less than a few pounds, and it's fairly cheap, $1,000, $2,000 or so. I know that's kind of expensive for a computer, but compared to the original computer, it's very cheap. This industrial revolution has led to the lessening of prices for products. It's also led to more urbanization, meaning that more people are living in the cities, and now we have more people living in cities than on agricultural land, which is the first time in history that that's ever been possible. Um, Last thing I talked about new technology already a little bit, but you have the steam engine, you have the power loom, which makes making clothes, textiles quicker. Same with the spinning jenny. You have the locomotive, so a new way of transportation, which is going to lead to railroads all across the world. That will eventually evolve into the automobile, which then leads to roads, and eventually we'll get to the airplane and flying around, and then spaceships, and so now we're kind of in a space age type deal with the modern age, or with the industrial revolution. And this could arguably still be going on because we're still making new inventions. We haven't really gone actually much beyond the steam engine. Your car functions on the same premise that that steam engine did. Um, Power looms are still pretty similar. They're more complex than they were before, but they're still kind of doing the same thing. So we're still using a lot of the same technology that we were before. Just now we've updated it and modernized it. Last part that's happening here is there has been a greater inequality, definitely to start. That's starting to even out some now as we get farther and farther into this industrial revolution, or past the industrial revolution, if you want to say it ended. But at the same time, we still have a lot of inequality going on in the U.S. and throughout the world, especially when you compare the rest of the world to the United States. So it's led to more inequality, led to some problems with that, which are still being solved. But the question I want to leave you with, after all you've seen with this, and we're going to talk about this more when we look at some primary sources, is, was this a step forward for mankind in this industrial revolution, or was it a step backwards? Because if you look at all the things that are happening now, take into account what you've seen previously in history and what you're seeing going on today,